for the obligee and the obligor. General rule, presumption, identification, definition, effects, separate, and analysis. Several for the obligor. Obligations involving multiple people can be several, joint, or solidary. Here, the obligation at issue is several for the obligor. If an obligation is several for the obligor, meaning there is more than one obligor, then each obligor owes a separate performance to one obligee. The effect of several obligation is that the obligations are treated as separately contracted obligations. Several for the obligee. Obligations involving multiple people can be several, joint, or solidary. All obligations are presumed to be joint. However, the obligation at issue is several for the obligee. If an obligation is several for the obligee, meaning there is more than one obligee, then one obligor owes separate performances to each obligee. The effect of a several obligation is that the obligations are treated as separately contracted obligations. Joint for the obligee and obligor. General rule, presumption, identification, definition, effects, default, interruption, and entitlements, and then the analysis. When one obligor owes just one performance intended for the common benefit of different obligees, none of whom are entitled to the whole performance, the obligation is joint for the obligees. All obligations are presumed to be joint. If only one joint obligee puts the obligor in default, only that joint obligee enjoys the benefit of doing so. When only one joint obligee interrupts prescription, prescription is not interrupted against all other obligees. Joint obligees are entitled to their virile share, meaning that the performance is usually divided by the number of joint obligees unless the law or contract says otherwise. Joint for the obligor. When different obligors owe together just one performance to one obligee, but none of the obligors are bound for the whole performance, the obligation is joint for the obligor. All obligations are presumed to be joint. If the obligee puts one joint obligor in default, the others are not in default. If the obligee interrupts prescription as to one joint obligor, prescription is not interrupted as to the others. Joint obligors owe their virile share, meaning that the total performance owed is usually divided among the number of joint obligors unless the law or parties say otherwise. Solidary for the obligees. General rule, presumption, identification, definition, how solidarity arises, effects, entitlement, default, prescription, remission, novation, and analysis. Solidary for the obligee. Solidarity is never presumed. All obligations are presumed to be joint, and the person urging solidarity must prove its existence. Solidarity arises by will or by the law. When solidarity arises by will, it must include a clear expression of the party's will. Parties must use the phrase solidarily bound or bound in solido. When solidarity arises by law, conspiring to commit intentional or willful acts renders tortfeasors solidarily bound. An obligation is solidary for the obligees when it gives each obligee the right to demand the whole performance from the common obligor. When any solidary obligee can demand the whole performance from the common obligor. The obligor can extinguish the obligation by performance for any of the solidary obligees. The obligor can choose before the solidary obligee brings an action for performance. If the obligor performs in favor of one, the other obligees can go after the obligee that received the performance for their share. If one solidary obligee puts the obligor in default, he is in default as to all of them. Delay and damages will be owed to each of them from that day. Any act that interrupts prescription on an obligee benefits all other solidary obligees. Remission is a release, express or tactic with no form requirement, by the obligee of the debt owed by the obligor to the obligee, and it extinguishes the obligation. A solidary obligee may remit or release from the debt, but this releases the obligor only from the portion owed by the solidary obligee or to the solidary obligee. One solidary obligee cannot erase the part of the debt that would have come to that solidary obligee. Novation is a means of extinguishing one obligation by submitting a new one in its place. There can be no novation with one solidary obligee without the consent of the others. Solidary for the obligor. General rule, presumption, identification, definition, how solidarity arises, effects, performance, damages, default, prescription, risk of insolvency, renunciation, remission, transaction compromise, and analysis. Solidary for the obligor. Solidarity is never presumed. All obligations are presumed to be joint. The person urging solidarity must prove its existence. Solidarity arises by will or by law. When solidarity arises by will, the intent of the parties must include a clear expression of the parties' will. Parties must use the phrase solidarily bound or bound in solido. An obligation is solidary for the obligors when each obligor is liable for the whole performance. The obligee can demand the whole performance from any or all of the obligors, meaning that the obligee may choose. If one solidary obligor fully performs, the other solidary obligors owe nothing to the obligee. If one solidary obligor partially performs, the balance owed is still solidary, even for the one who performed. This is true regardless of whether the amount performed is equal to the performing solidary obligor's obligation, was less or was more. If the obligor performs, she is subrogated to the rights of the obligee, becomes the obligee against the remaining obligors, but does not receive the obligee's right of solidarity. This means the other obligors are just jointly liable to the one who performed for their virile share. This is called contribution. If one solidary obligor is at fault, all the obligors are liable to the obligee for the whole. Innocent solidary obligors can recover damages from the at-fault obligor. Putting one solidary obligor in default puts all of them in default. Any act that interrupts prescription against all solidary obligors also interrupts solidarity against their heirs. If a solidary obligor becomes insolvent, the other solidary obligors bears his portion in proportion to their own. The obligee of a solidary obligation may expressly renounce solidarity in favor of one or more of the solidary obligors. If the obligee renounces solidarity in favor of all solidary obligors, the debt becomes joint. If the obligee renounces solidarity in favor of less than all the solidary obligors, the obligee gets the renounced one's share from him, and the remaining obligors are solidarily bound for the remainder. This is the total debt minus the obligor's share. If the obligee renounces solidarity in favor of less than all of the solidary obligors, then one obligor becomes insolvent. The renounced one is still liable to the other obligors for the insolvent's obligor's share. An obligee can forgive one or more of the solidary obligors. This is known as remission. Remission benefits the solidary obligors in the amount of the remitted portion. If the obligee releases one or more solidary obligors, and one or more of the solidary obligors left becomes insolvent, the obligee bears the loss. With remission, the debt is being released entirely. A transaction or compromise is like a settlement and operates like remission. With compromise, the debt is being released partially. The obligor is obligated to pay less money. A solidary obligor can raise defenses based on the nature of the obligation, whether it is common to all or personal to him. Defenses raised on the nature of the obligation include illegal object, formality problems, impossibility, full performance, prescription, compromise of whole, remission of whole, compensation, confusion, renunciation as to all, or novation. A solidary obligor cannot raise a defense that is personal to another solidary obligor, like another's capacity, bankruptcy, a term or condition on another's obligation, or a vice tainting the consent of another.